We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Richmond, and I'm EWA's public editor. I will be the moderator for today's conversation. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. First, a reminder that this is being recorded. Everything is on the record, including the chat. If you hover over the speaker screen, you should see a button for closed captioning and live transcript. To start viewing the closed captioning, you can click closed caption. To view the live transcript, click live transcript and then select show subtitle. If you want to submit a question for our speakers, you please use the chat box located in the Pathable platform. I'm also going to be asking you to chime in there a couple of times during this session, so you're going to want to keep that open. You can submit a question at any point throughout the session, and EWA staffer Eric Roebelin will be monitoring these questions, and he's going to help facilitate the Q&A portion at the end. And finally, if you're going to tweet about this session, please use the hashtag EWA21. Now let's turn to our conversation. At a time of political division, social discord, and deep distrust in many communities, schools are helping students make sense of the upheaval. Character education and a focus on civic virtues can play an important role in turning that upheaval into teachable moments. I want to introduce today's speakers who are going to help us dig into these very important and complex issues. First up, Arria Coburn is principal at the Springfield Renaissance School. It is a public magnet middle high school about 90 miles west of Boston. Also joining us is Ashley Rogers Berner. She is an associate professor and the director of the Institute for Education Policy at Johns Hopkins University. Andrew Smarick is a senior policy fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he is also a past president of the Maryland State Board of Education. Thank you all for being here. Before we get started, I do want to ask the audience for a little bit of help and just to figure out where you're all coming from. And I want to start with some vocabulary. Please go over to the chat feature on the Pathable platform and answer this question. What would you consider the most important character trait for schools to help students develop? If you can pick one trait in a word or two, what would be your choice? If you go ahead and start adding that to the chat, we'll give you just a minute or two to answer. So a quick answer from Gail Robinson, I see empathy, curiosity is another one popping up, passion, collaboration, trust. Another vote for collaboration, care for others, critical thinking. They're coming in fast and furious now as people are warming up. Let's try to just get maybe one or two more. We're looking for what you think is the most important character trait for schools to help students develop. Purpose, sense of purpose. And responsibility. These are all great answers. Thanks, everybody. So Arria, your school is part of the EL Education Network, which focuses on expeditionary learning. What does character education look like in your school? Are those words that we would hear if we were walking through the halls?
Excellent, great question. And so character education is something that you definitely would see as you walk through the halls. Printed on in all of our classrooms. We do have our 7 character traits that we focus on. And so I'll start with answering it as what it means to be a EL school. And so one attribute that you'll see at all EL schools is crew. Many people compare crew to advisory. And while it is sort of advisory, it's a lot more because a lot of our character development happens during that. So crew meets every day for about 30 minutes. And during that time, teachers are focusing on lessons that have been created by students as well as our staff. And we're really focusing on our 7 character traits. So for example, this week, we have lessons that have been created by our students, and they're focusing on Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And so while we have our 7 character traits that we're upholding all the time, when we allow students to have voice and choice in lessons that they're participating in, we are modeling character traits. We are being intentional, right? We're showing what it looks like when students have voice. And we're also modeling, courage, right? It takes all of those pieces. And so the lesson isn't just something that the teachers unpack and deliver. When the lesson is being given, teachers are also saying, okay, where do we see courage showing up? Where do we see friendship showing up in this? And one of our character traits is also cultural sensitivity, which we've been focused on given what's happening in the world. So really leveraging our, in particular, character traits unique to our school and the lessons that we do. And so character development is very explicit and it's intentional. And one of the things that I'll also stress is that for us, character development doesn't just live in this one class crew. It also lives in all that we do. And so our character traits show up in every single class that is being taught. It's an expectation that when the teacher is setting up lessons, he or she is also thinking about what character trait am I going to lift up in this lesson.
Well, that's really interesting because when you talk about it being intentional and the teacher is modeling it, so it sounds like it's part of the DNA of the day as opposed to now we're going to stop what we're doing and talk about character education.
Absolutely. For me, I think it's really important as a building leader to make sure that that character development is happening the moment the students arrive at school. So when they're getting off the bus, it's very intentional for us to make sure that we have an adult there that's greeting them. We are showing friendship. We are making sure that we know our students' names. And so even during lunchtime when students are talking, we are looking for our character traits and saying like, wow, that was really nice. That took a lot of courage for you to do, or wow, that's a nice example of friendship. So we try to use it in all of our conversation in everything that we do, because character education cannot just live in one class. It really has to be the through line that exists in everything we do. So if we're having an event at the school, yes, we have the logistics, but we're also thinking about what are those character traits we're going to lift up, and we're bringing in students to be part of that development in that thought process.
That's very great. So we are going to talk a little bit about vocabulary and also making some distinctions between some definitions. So now I want to jump in. I want to turn for a moment to civic virtues. So I'm going to ask everybody in the audience the same kind of question that we asked for character education. Go over to the chat and tell us what is an important civic virtue for students to develop. What would you consider maybe the most important virtue? If they're going to take a civic virtue out of their K-12 experience, what do you think it should be? And we'll just give them just a second or two to answer in there. And then I'm going to share those. And then I'm going to ask Ashley to weigh in on this one. So we hear empathy, responsible participation. I think that's definitely something I'm going to be talking about during this session. Community support. These are all great answers. Being involved and informed, another great one. So actually, while these are coming in and we're seeing things like giving to others, being involved and informed, how do these words fit into maybe the academic definition of civic virtues? And is that any different from how people were sort of talking about it more in like the mainstream, or maybe how that concept is being politicized?
Good question. So academics, in particular political scientists, tend to look at civic virtue in terms of 4 core capacities. The first is political knowledge. Then there's political skills. Then there's civil tolerance. And then there's finally the habit of involvement, of community involvement. So let me just unpack those a little bit. So the political knowledge is not just how do American institutions work, but what is the relationship between the state and society and the individual? What was it like in the Middle Ages? What is it like in certain governments that are totalitarian? Where are different countries? Having students really imbibe geography and religion and philosophy, all the core bodies of knowledge that we need to navigate political life or understanding. So, and then the second one is the skills of being able to analyze, to write clearly, to use correct grammar and syntax and so forth, so that you can analyze legislation or participate in a debate. The third is civil tolerance. And this is the one that's probably in shortest supply in our country now, although I would say all 4 are in short supply. Civil tolerance, simply the capacity to hold other people's opinions with respect. And that comes from classroom and family engagement with deliberation, debate, where you're arguing about ideas and not about people. And again, I just want to emphasize, this is something that schools can and should be doing. Very few do. Really important. Most democracies pressure test for this. And then the last is the habit of civic engagement. And those are not just they're voting, volunteering, and so forth. So all four of those are things. The good news is we can support those, all four, in the home. We can support them in school. And certainly our institute works with quite a few schools and school systems on these.
So Andy, you spent much of the past year talking with educators, policymakers, other big thinkers about these issues and where they intersect in schools and in public education. This idea of schools building an engaged and informed citizenry, and I liked what Ashley said, talking about this idea of you can argue about ideas, but not with the people. And I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned and maybe a couple of the big takeaways that rise to the top for you? If you were a reporter here, what's your nut graph?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So just as a brief background, I've been like in and around education policy for about 2 decades now. And the more I read about the history of education, it became really apparent to me that going back literally millennia, people considered moral character development part of a proper education. But in 20 years of doing education policy, I can't remember ever really in policy circles having a conversation about character, moral, civic virtue, education. It was just outside. So I was curious why this was the case. Almost like the dog that didn't bark. It's a story. The story is that something didn't happen that probably should have. So I asked these 18 people who I respected, kind of across the political spectrum, different domains of experience, different geographies, different race, kind of as diverse a group as I could. How are they thinking about character and civic virtue? And so I gave them all a set of questions to answer. And 4 things really popped out as like the commonalities across. Obviously, there wasn't consensus, but the big themes that came across was, number one, schools are teaching character whether they admit it or not. So at least be intentional about it. Like the way you talk to kids, the way you engage with parents, the way that adults carry themselves, comport themselves, you're giving lessons on character. So at least have conversations about that. The second was, even though there are just so many, probably dozens, I don't know, hundreds of different philosophies of character and virtue, going back to the ancients, more modern things, that are different in pedigree, different in emphasis, there are overlaps that people identified that even if you don't want to get into some of these political fights, there are certain things that pop up in all of these schools of thought that kids probably ought to learn. Things like compassion and fairness and honesty, patience, self-motivation, temperance, responsibility. So you don't have to go all in on one school of thought. There's this overlap that's really important. The third thing is that even though there is this overlap, it's the case that different people, different communities are going to reach different conclusions about what character, what virtue are all about. And America is a continental pluralistic republic, and that's okay that we come to different conclusions. So this is why we have small school districts. It's also why we have school choice. So we can talk about this more, but the idea that a community could come to a consensus on what their definition of character is, but maybe some families disagree. So we should acknowledge that. Do we try to help them find a school community that fits them better? I know I would be really uncomfortable if my kids were going to a school where they taught visions of character I didn't agree with. And then the last thing here is that everybody pretty much agreed that we don't need to turn character, virtue, all these subjects into like reading and math where there are state tests and accountability systems. As a matter of fact, everybody agreed that would warp it, it would distort it, and it would just go sideways. That parents and educators and community members can figure this out themselves. So don't think that we need an accountability system for character and virtue. Just have conversations about it and then let educators and families hold everyone accountable.
So Arria, I noticed you nodding when Andy mentioned the idea that families have to have buy-in here. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were thinking?
Yeah, I was just thinking about our character traits that we have. While we haven't changed them, what they look like are definitely specific to the students that we're serving at the time. I think that many schools get caught up with, okay, so we want to make sure that we're teaching respect. We want to make sure that we're teaching empathy. What does that look like? And then you have a bunch of adults in the room coming up with the definition for that. And there's a mistake that you make with that. You really have to pull in, as Andy said, students and families, because you may have you may have defined the word respect. So that's a big one in our school. And for different cultures, it looks different and it means different things. And so you definitely could have good intent, but if you haven't pulled in all of the stakeholders, you definitely run the risk of not having that indicator or that character trait lived out the way that you envision. And so I can remember some instances where, we either had some crew lessons, again, getting at things that are happening and really trying to pull in that empathy. And some of our parents, said, no, that's not what I want my kid talking about. To me, that isn't empathy. And so you really have to make sure that when you're making decisions that you are being inclusive of who's at that table and who's defining those words and those indicators that we're calling character traits.
So Arria, I want to stay with you for a moment. We do want to talk about some specific teachable moments from the past year. And I know that for you, January 6th and the insurrection at the nation's capital was one of those days for your school. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so we came back from winter break and we were met with the insurrection that happened. And so teachers met in the evening to come up with a lesson. And so we're always trying to be in tune and responsive to what's happening. And so the next day, I made a video and a public statement. One, because I wanted to make sure parents understood that at our school, when these incidents happen, we're going to talk about it. But I knew that, for some of our parents, I would be met with perhaps some resistance, and I was. And so, some of the comments from parents were, I don't want my kid involved in this conversation. And so even though I see it as character development, even though I see it as teaching empathy and pushing our students to be critical thinkers, some of our parents pushed back and they opted to not have their child part of the lesson and the experience. And so for me, it's having that conversation to understand more. And so I never shut it down. It's always, tell me more about that. And so here's the issue. How do I get at that? Because our goal as a school is to make sure that we are preparing our students for the world outside of the K through 12 experience. And so, I'm always able to gain some insight from parents. One of the parents just felt, their child wasn't ready for it. And so they felt like, they're still grappling with it as an adult. And so they wanted to have the conversation. So it wasn't necessarily that it was a complete no. It was more of a not yet.
Interesting. So Ashley, when we're talking about putting the onus on schools to help students sort of engage and understand that there are inequities and injustices out in the world, how do schools avoid maybe reproducing some of those inequities and injustices, including in how they define things like civic virtue?
That's a huge question. And yeah. I find the easiest way to answer is to look at some of the international models rather than our own context. Most democracies are different from ours in the way they structure and the way they fill the content of public education. So most democracies will fund schools they're very distinctive in their mission, their purpose, their vocabulary that allow that kind of ethos to differ. So the Netherlands, for example, funds 36 different kinds of schools on equal footing. And, Jewish, Montessori, socialist, whatever. England, Sweden, most democracies do this. And they also require a high body of knowledge. So, best case, you've got distinctiveness in the bones and framework of the school, and you have a common shared vocabulary and body of knowledge that's being cultivated no matter what school you go to. And what that does is this: it allows parents to understand the difference between exposure and indoctrination. So most OECD countries require comparative religion and ethics every year, K to 12, as a kind of formative kind of learning need that students have. That means that your kid's going to be learning about Marxism. If you hate Marxism, it's going to be learning about the claims of Judaism if you're Islamic, and that's a good thing. But we're so far from that. Our habits are very, very different. So what we look at when we look at a schools or a school curriculum or a school pedagogy is, are there multiple viewpoints presented? Are students supported as they learn to articulate their own claims, even if they're alone in that? And I think when you can norm a school around these goals, it works really, really well and everybody feels safe. But it is very hard and it's not happening enough. That's enough for me on that. I
No,
could talk
that's-
about
it
this.
is-
I could talk about this all day.
It is hard work. And I think and Andy has written about how hard this work can be. And I want to ask Andy this question. Based on, we know that there are different kinds of civic virtues. They typically fall into these categories. We have moral virtues, intellectual virtues, performance virtues. If I'm an education reporter and I'm visiting a school, which one am I most likely to be seeing in action? Which one is the teacher going to point out to me to say, we're doing civic virtue?
That's a great question. All right, so the people who've been writing about virtues and character for a long time, there's somewhat of a consensus that you can think of these 4 different categories of like these kind of skills attributes that students ought to have. The first is intellectual virtues. So things like curiosity, skepticism, knowledge accumulation. Schools usually do a great job on that and they're very explicit about it. The second category is what we call performance virtues. So these are skills attributes that enable people to succeed. Things like hard work, initiative. This became really famous over the past decade with the term grit, perseverance. Often schools do a great job of doing those 2 things and talking a whole lot about them, because who's against knowledge accumulation? Who is against hard work and grit? It's the third and fourth categories that become a little bit more difficult. So civic virtue is one of them. Yes, everyone wants students to participate, but participate how? So there's a difference between, for example, protest and preservation. How much of our energy should be about changing the system? How much should it be about realizing that we have something really special in America and we need to make sure that we're not undermining things? So that becomes hard sometimes for schools to talk about. And then the last category, moral virtue. The reason why this becomes so important is you could imagine generating students who are really smart, really gritty, but they don't know what to be smart and gritty about. What if we have a gritty, persistent student who wants to do evil, who wants to fib, who wants to just get ahead? So there needs to be some sort of component about what do we want, what is the North Star that we want to direct our students to? And these conversations can be hard. Is it just truth? Is it just honesty? Is it a vision of the common good, the public good? Is it about the sanctity of the human person? I mean, people have been writing about this, again, for literally thousands of years, but those last 2 categories, civic virtue and moral virtue, I find the most interesting because, sort of like Ashley was talking about, remember e pluribus unum, like out of many one. We need to recognize that there's some things we should hold in common, but there are also going to be differences among us in different communities. So how do we balance what are the things that we all should share in vision of virtue and character? And what are the things where we say, community X may have one vision of loyalty vis-a-vis honesty, whereas community B may elevate one above the other. There's not like a simple roadmap on this. It requires deliberative democracy.
So we've got a lot of reporters in the audience, and the thing the reporters always want to know is how do we see beyond, so these anecdotal examples of where character education and civic virtues are being carried out, where it's being applied and where it's sticking to kids and making a meaningful difference. So I'm going to ask each of you in turn if you can just give me a quick answer to this question. But Arria, how are you assessing whether it's a success? How are you assessing your staff's performance and your students' engagement and understanding of these issues? How do you measure it?
That's a great question. And I think that over the years, we've gotten better. Really, the pandemic sort of pushed us to think about that more so because we were teaching students who were on Zoom. And so we do a lot of student surveys that we gather input. But I think that the biggest piece of how we measure it is hearing from the students, less of a survey style and more of having a student group that is able to give you authentic feedback and be that pulse check. And so we have 2 student groups that meet weekly, a student voice group and a crew ambassador group. And both of those groups are authentically honest about what's working and what's not working. And we empower them, right? And so they're not just giving us their feedback and we're saying, like, okay, great. We're taking their feedback, we're putting it into action. And then as a principal, I'm reporting back to the students to say, like, so this is some feedback that you said about how we're doing with belongingness. And here are some pieces that we put in place based off of your feedback.
Interesting. So Ashley, from the research perspective, is there some kind of correlation that we can find between the schools that are doing a good job with this, and is it showing up in other places, like on the NAEP civics test when we used to give NAEP civics?
Well, the NAEP civic scores are not looking very good these days. The latest round came out, and indeed with civics, history, and geography, our most advanced students are not performing well on this. So I guess I would give a twofold answer. First of all, I think from the standpoint of research, we can't really demonstrate character in that it is behavioral, it is long-term, it is often very not overt, sometimes by design. So I would say the best studies of kind of measuring outcomes and isolating the school effect, say, are the kind of longitudinal surveys of young adults or middle-aged people, and Cardis in Canada has done quite a lot of this, and actually trying to do regression analyses and see which kinds of schools do a very good job of raising young people in their adulthood to be civil, all of these things that we want to. And so that's the best way, I think, not looking at the schools in the here and now, but looking at adult behavior long-term. There are some correlations. And I would say the things to focus on again in the here and now would be this really, really robust knowledge build and a very distinctive school culture where the claims are not just anodyne, but where they live, like Arria is talking about, where they live within the fabric of the community, the vocabulary. A great book about this is Scott Sider's book, Character Compass, that just shows how 3 different charter schools in the same town, Boston, how they differ in important ways and help drive student success and formative ways, not just academic ways.
So what do you think, Andy? I mean, what questions should reporters be asking when they're looking for some kind of evidence here? And what did you hear in all those interviews you were doing when I'm sure this question came up?
Yeah, it did. And one thing I'd like to point out to policy people, and this will be no news to reporters who actually go into schools, but policy people often think that schools are totally hands-off when it comes to character because they're so nervous about getting sued or getting in trouble for having one moral philosophy as opposed to another. But virtually every school I've ever been in, especially elementary schools, are good about you walk in and there's a creed near the door, or on the walls there will be things like character counts or honesty, or we believe in loyalty here. So schools are pretty good about talking about this stuff. The question that I would ask is to a principal or to a set of teachers, how do you know you're doing well on these things that you're writing on the walls? Do you do professional development? Do you ask parents about it? Do you go through an iterative process every year or every couple of years with your school board or with your parents just to say, listen, times have changed. Maybe we need to elevate accommodation and civility as opposed to a certain view on justice. We want to make sure that our students learn how to have conversations with people, whatever that conversation may be. Just asking the educators, how do you think about implementing and then checking yourself on whether they're just words that are hanging on the wall or part of the lifeblood of the system.
So Arria, can you give us an example maybe of a time in your school where a student had to demonstrate that they disagreed with an idea and not with the person?
You mean just disagreements that our students have had, or how we've used character education?
Yeah, how do you do that?
So I think anytime we are mediating a situation, we always utilize our character traits. I think the one that we've had to sort of massage a bit is how we define cultural sensitivity. And I think it's one that we often go back to. And so anytime we have an incident that is involving 2 students, we really try to leverage the conversation in our character traits. And I think cultural sensitivity and friendship and respect are the 3 that students don't always agree with, right? Where they will say, I don't see that as disrespect. I don't see that as not having cultural sensitivity. That's me expressing myself. And so we've had to come to how do you negotiate that conversation where you're hearing everyone, right? And the students, especially, we're 6 through 12, our high school students will call us out immediately and say that doesn't sound like friendship. And so we have to be really clear about what we're talking about. And so even though we have indicators, there are times that we're having a conversation and we have to be really clear. So for this conversation, when we're thinking about respect, can you share with me what it means to you so that everyone is able to talk about it. And then in that meeting, we might come up with a definition to say, like, so as we're leading this conversation, here's what we've agreed respect will look like in this conversation. And I think sometimes there's a danger where schools, as Andy said, like they have these indicators, they've got the posters on the wall that they've invested all this money towards, and they're like, no, this is what it looks like. And if it looks anything like that, then they're like, oh no. And teachers get nervous. And so we've done a lot of prep work with our teachers to say, it has to be evolving. Character can't be a one size fits all. You have to be okay with adapting to the situation when it comes to character education.
And you've really had to adapt this year with going remote. I mean, that's created some really kind of incredible challenges for you. We've all read the horror stories in just about every major newspaper about all the kids who just sort of disappeared this year, or just be, cameras off on remote learning and just have no idea how they were doing or where they went. How did that play out for you?
Yeah, so I go back to, we have our 7 character traits. And while we felt like we were hitting all of those, the one that we didn't have was making sure that our students felt that they belonged, right? And so we had cameras off and, meeting with a group of students, they said, I'm on Zoom. I don't hear my name being said. The teacher isn't doing that small talk, because there's no small talk with Zoom. You come on Zoom and you're like, hey, everyone, how's it going? Good, we're going to get started. And the teachers are going. There's some comments in the chat real quick. Oh, great. I see that Andy said this, but we don't hear Andy's voice. And so the students pushed back and said, I don't feel welcomed. And so we had to change our indicators for this year. And we had to intentionally pause because the students wanted to make sure that they heard their names being said. And the group that I met with, they tracked it. And so they said, yeah, these were my 6th graders. They were ready. Wow. They said, in a week's time, I should hear my name at least 3 times in a class. And I said, okay. And so I gave that feedback to the teachers, and on their agenda board, when they started class, every teacher, when a student is entering Zoom, they are saying, good morning, Ashley. Good morning, Andy. Love to see you. And then they're making sure that they're doing some private conversations, say like, Andy, love the gray sweatshirt, because for students, that was important. That was part of what they needed this year. So they definitely hold us accountable for sure.
Wow. Well, we're going to give people a few more minutes to drop in any questions. I've got plenty left on my list, so we're just going to keep making the most of this time that we have together. So a little bit of a lightning round. Okay, I'm a reporter. I get a press release from a school district. They're announcing a new program in character education. What are the red flags? What am I watching for that would maybe give me pause? Ashley?
I think a red flag for me would be it's a bolt-on. It's something that just is like an SEL program, a character program. Remember in the 90s, every state had requirements for character education. It fell flat because it was largely a bolt-on. So that would be the big flag for me, instead of being embedded in the school.
Interesting. Andy, how about you?
Yeah, along those lines, there's a balance here. One is the problem that in one direction, that it would it would come from somewhere else, and it wasn't an organic, deliberative process that someone just got, a piece of paper and $10,000 to implement something and said, oh yeah, we'll do these, 5 things. The other problem is on the other side, where there's a program that just tells students what they want to hear. We have to remember that schools, like every other great institution, they're designed to be formative. We're all imperfect, especially young people, and kids have to learn, especially the youngest, certain things. And even if children don't like to be told you have to be civil, or accommodation needs to be practiced here, especially at the high school level, those kinds of things are important. The adults in the school and in the community saying we are the adults, and we have to make sure that our students, even if this rubs up against them, that we think that this is important as a formative institution.
That's a great answer. So let me just take up on the flip side of that then. What are the in-school factors that make character education more likely to be successful? I mean, Arria, you talked about some of them, which is sort of being embedded into the DNA of the expectations of the students, the staff, and the parents. What am I leaving out?
I definitely think making sure that teachers are ready for it. I think that, again, what makes our character program work is because students also have a role in it. And I think that, for some of our newer teachers, you get taken back if a student's saying like, well, that's not what friendship means to me. And for me, when I'm engaged in a dialogue and a student says that, I'm okay with that. Great. Tell me more about that. What does it mean to you? And so I would say that teachers have to be ready for the pushback when they're sort of like what Andy's saying, these canned words. What does that mean when you're talking about self-discipline? What does empathy look like? And so if the school doesn't have a shared vision and understanding, at least as some framework, then I think that the character education program just isn't going to work. It's going to be something that are posters on a wall rather than something that is alive and living.
And that's gonna pay off, isn't it? When the kids are no longer in that classroom where those posters are on the wall. It has to be something that they're going to carry with them. We do have a question. It's from Megan Valley. It's a great question. And the question is, in a lot of districts, there's evidence that teachers and other staff are over-disciplining students of color or students with disability, or failing to put those students in challenging classes. Can those schools still teach something like cultural sensitivity with any authority? Or does there need to be a fundamental change at the staff level before that sort of moral education can happen? So I see Ashley's got her hand up, so we're going to call on Ashley first.
I am really happy that question came up, because when we do our school culture 360 with many kinds of schools, one of the things we look for is equal access to challenging coursework. And, we've had to have some tough conversations with school partners that, hey, your mission is this, everyone's clear on what it should be, but yet you've got this striking gap here in which kids get access to really robust courses, and the parents know it and the kids know it. So if you want to bring that part of your school's culture in line with the kind of values that you're espousing, this is what needs to shift. So absolutely, kids know what's going on, and they know if they're not being taken seriously. And I'm sure Arria could give us a host of stories about that too. But I absolutely, in the research, it's very clear that this can happen. So good question.
Andy, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, schools lose their moral authority when they behave in immoral ways. So if you are a school community and you want to teach discipline and you want to teach self-control and restraint and initiative, you have to be very mindful on a day-to-day basis. Are we treating everybody fairly? Are we being equitable in all of our practices? Because once the community, especially students, realize that you're doling out punishment in a way that's not fair, treating different students differently, it becomes a whole lot harder for them to take seriously when the adults in the school are giving them lectures about restraint or accommodation or civility. This is something that came through in all of my interviews, which is, if you're going to take character and virtue seriously, it has to begin with the adults in the building. Do they take it seriously? Do they realize that with the power of shaping young people comes the responsibility of behaving in certain ways? So what kind of training do they get? What kind of professional development? It's a huge responsibility.
Arria.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's such a big question. I think what comes to mind immediately is, I think that there's the character education piece that you want to focus on. But I think anytime you're thinking about race and equity, you want to, again, make sure that there's a through line. So you want to start with the teachers, right? To make sure that, as Andy said, professional development has been done to support them so that they understand what the school's goals are. And I think just as a leader, being really clear, like, here's what it's going to look like, because there's a piece of it where you have to have high expectations, right? There's no negotiation, especially when we're dealing with race and equity. And so from a leadership standpoint, being very clear about what our goals are around race and equity. And then I think also, again, having that conversation with students. And I think that that's been the hardest piece for us, because again, at the middle school level, some of our families don't want those conversations happening. And so, it is my job to make sure that our families understand that at our school, an urban school in Springfield, we are absolutely going to talk about this. I will let you know every time we talk about it, but we are going to talk about it.
Well, let's stick with that. I mean, so what is your advice for addressing racial bias and racial equity as issues of character ed? You've said a little bit about what that looks like, and it sounds like it's really about keeping those lines of communication open, and an expectation that you're not talking at them, that you're going to talk with them. It sounds like it has to be at least a two-way conversation.
Yeah. So we've had a series of different stakeholders come in. So we had a parent group that was our race and equity parent group. We had about 8 to 10 parents come in and lead the conversation. They looked at our school data. They gave us some feedback on it. We also had the student group going on. We had the teacher group going on. And all of those pieces, all of those stakeholders were helping drive what our goals were for the school. And then we came up with sort of our mission, like, here's what we're going to do. Here are the goals that we're going to attend to, and here's how we want to be held accountable. And I think that, when I'm meeting parents, even for like our incoming students, I make it very clear that at this school, race and equity is just as important for us to talk about as it is sort of that content material that we have to talk about. And so our community knows that if there's an incident involving race and equity, we're going to talk about it. We're going to couch it using our character traits, but it will be talked about. And so parents have come to know and understand that.
So just a couple minutes left. I don't want to let you go without asking something that would be very helpful for the journalists in the audience. And that is, what is a story idea you'd like to see them write about, or something, an angle you think that's been undercovered on either character education, civic virtues, or maybe the Venn diagram where those kind of go together? Andy.
Yeah, the two things that I'm most interested in, just as a reader of newspapers, the first is, what are schools doing to generate a next generation of citizens who care about one another and can listen to one another and can engage in this kind of the public's business and argue about ideas, not argue to people or about people or insult them. So whether you want to call it civility, accommodation, the stuff of the public square, how are schools thinking about that? And then the second one is more along this e pluribus unum front, which is, I think it's important that we recognize that, I have very strong feelings on what character and virtue look like, but I also recognize that there are 330 million people in the United States, and I'm not the dictator. I don't get to tell everybody what they believe on these things. So if a reporter had the opportunity to look at 3, 4, 5 different schools and recognize that school community, these 5 school communities may have come to different conclusions, and that's okay. Where they come together, where there's overlap is really important, but because of our history of differences of religion and culture and just like lived experience in a geography, they're going to prioritize different things. That's okay. That's America. That's fantastic. But how do we also make sure that all students are learning certain things that are important for natural rights, natural law, civility, honesty, that there has to be something in that Venn diagram where there's overlap.
Okay. Ashley, story idea.
The international structure and content of education is just fascinating. And you realize how much we have to learn from even, provinces like Alberta, Canada, or Sweden, or the Netherlands, or Denmark. So that's the first one, how they handle character and civic formation. And then the second is, I'm really interested in what it takes from an administrator to give teachers permission to do what Arria is talking about. We have worked with lots of school systems in which if a teacher mentions a minority religion, for example, parents get upset. And, how can you, where are the administrators and system leaders who say, look, exposure is not indoctrination. Here's what it looks like to scaffold meaningful debate, and we're going to do it. There are a lot of moves that have to happen, and, stories about what it takes and why it's important.
Fantastic. Arria, I'm going to give you the last word. If I'm a reporter and I call you up and say, I want to come to your school, what do you want us to write about?
Great. I would love to see character education written with the equity lens. I don't see enough about it. And so I would push reporters to think about, when you're thinking about character education and you're thinking about what it means as you shift through different settings, how do you think about it with the equity lens? So that would be something that I would be really curious about, and I haven't read a lot about it.
I blinked and the session just went, whew. It just flew by. What a great conversation. Thank you all so much for making time for the EWA National Seminar and for preparing so beautifully. Thank you to all of our attendees. We really enjoyed having your energy, and we hope to see you in person at the next National Seminar. Just a quick reminder before we log off, you will get an email next week with an evaluation form. Please complete it. We take member feedback very seriously. We use it to improve our offerings. I want to thank Ashley Berner for joining us, Arria Coburn, Andrew Smarick, of course. Next, in just a moment, we do have the EWA Pet Parade featuring our members and their favorite companion animals. And at 4 p.m., we will resume with another session for the day. On the K-12 front, we'll be talking about summer school, and on the higher ed side, we'll be looking at race on campus, and we hope to see you at both of those sessions. So thank you very much, everybody, on behalf of EWA. It's been a pleasure.